Samantha had always dreamed of escaping the bustle of city life. The endless noise, the constant rush, the stress, she needed a break. The moment she packed her bags for a weekend trip into the wilderness, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. No phone signal, no emails, just the soft hum of the forest around her. It was exactly what she needed to clear her mind and recharge. She parked her old, beat-up Jeep at the edge of a secluded trailhead, surrounded by towering pines. The air was fresh, crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine needles and damp soil. A soft breeze stirred the trees, creating a melody that reminded her of the world she had left behind. For once, there was nothing demanding her attention. The only sounds were those of nature, the chirp of distant birds, the rustle of leaves underfoot. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. She slung her backpack over her shoulder and set off down the narrow trail. Her goal was a small cabin, nestled deep in the woods, a little off the beaten path. Her friends had recommended it, a perfect spot to disconnect. She smiled to herself, anticipating the solitude. As she hiked further into the woods, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead, casting long shadows across the path. There was something comforting about it, like the forest itself was welcoming her. She adjusted the straps on her backpack and quickened her pace. She couldn't wait to settle in and enjoy a few days of peace and quiet. The cabin was just a few miles away now. She could almost picture it, rustic and weathered, but cozy. It had a small fireplace and a wooden porch with a swing. The perfect place to unwind with a book or simply stare at the stars. Samantha smiled at the thought, her anticipation growing. However, as she drew closer to her destination, something began to feel off. The air was still, almost unnervingly so. The usual rustle of wildlife seemed to fade, leaving an eerie silence in its place. Her footsteps were the only sound on the trail, the soft crunch of dirt and gravel under her boots. She brushed off the feeling, telling herself it was nothing. Maybe it was the isolation playing tricks on her. After all, she was used to the noise of the city. Here, in the woods, it was different. Quiet. Calm. But as she reached the cabin, an odd sensation gripped her, a feeling she couldn't shake. She couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. She paused at the threshold, hand on the door handle, staring into the dim interior. The stillness inside was thick, almost oppressive. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. But then, taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The cabin creaked in protest, the wooden floorboards groaning as if they hadn't been disturbed in years. She stepped inside, hoping that this getaway would be everything she had imagined. But deep down, something told her she wasn't alone. The sun dipped behind the treetops, casting long shadows over the cabin. Inside, Samantha unpacked her things, her mind drifting as she prepared for a quiet evening. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust, a scent she found strangely comforting. She lit a fire in the stone fireplace and curled up in the armchair with a book, the crackling flames providing a soft backdrop to the stillness of the night. As the hours passed, the darkness outside grew deeper, and the forest became a sea of shifting shadows. The quiet, which had initially been soothing, now felt unnerving. Every creak of the old house seemed louder in the silence. Samantha shifted in her chair, trying to focus on the pages of her book, but her attention kept wandering to the windows. They were large, offering a clear view of the woods beyond, but in the darkness, all she could see were the vague outlines of trees. A sudden noise broke the stillness, a faint crackle, almost like something was moving in the underbrush outside. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. A deer, perhaps. Or maybe just the wind moving through the trees. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She stood up, walking to the window, and peered out into the blackness. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the woods shrouded in near-complete darkness. She could barely make out the shapes of the trees and bushes, but no sign of movement. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. She felt watched, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She shook her head, dismissing the thought. It was just the isolation. That's all. The mind could play tricks when it was alone for too long. But as she turned away from the window, she heard it again, a soft rustling, like footsteps moving through the leaves. It was coming from the direction of the tree line. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. There was no way a deer would make that much noise. Her pulse quickened. Someone was out there. Trying to calm herself, Samantha sat back down, grabbed her flashlight, and moved cautiously toward the door. She hesitated, her hand on the knob. Was she being paranoid? It had been a long day, after all. But the sensation that someone was watching her wouldn't go away. Just as she turned the handle, a loud knock on the door shattered the silence. Samantha jumped back, heart racing, the flashlight slipping from her hand. She stood frozen, staring at the door. Who would be out here? In the middle of nowhere, at this hour? The knock came again, louder this time, accompanied by a voice, low, muffled, almost a whisper. Let me in. I need help. Samantha's blood ran cold. Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of it. Was it a trap? Or a genuine plea for help? What if someone was in trouble? What if they needed her help? But she couldn't shake the fear gnawing at her. This was her first night in the woods, and she wasn't prepared to trust anyone out here, especially at this hour. Her instincts screamed at her to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning. But her curiosity was strong too. She cautiously approached the door, her mind in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Her hand hovered over the lock. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as she stared at the door. The soft whisper of the voice from outside still lingered in her mind, but she couldn't move. What if it was someone in distress? What if someone was out there, injured, alone? Her hand still hovered over the lock, but every instinct she had screamed for her to leave it. Trust no one. Taking a deep breath, Samantha turned away from the door and backed away, her eyes scanning the dark cabin. She had no idea who it was, or if she should even respond, but she was certain of one thing, she wasn't ready to face whatever might be out there. Not tonight. She sat down on the couch, her fingers trembling as she tried to regain control of her thoughts. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in the corners of the room. The night had grown unbearably still. The quiet was unnerving. After what felt like an eternity, she finally stood up, determined to find some sense of peace. Her mind raced, but the only way to clear it was to focus on something else. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, moving toward the back of the cabin. There, near the tree line, she froze. The ground was disturbed. The leaves had been trampled, and the grass flattened in a path that led right to the woods. Someone, or something, had been walking around the cabin. The marks were fresh, too recent to be from any wildlife. Samantha's breath hitched. The footsteps seemed deliberate, almost as if they had been pacing back and forth, circling her cabin. And they weren't just random wanderings. They had been placed in a pattern, as though someone had been studying her movements. A chill ran down her spine. She turned and walked briskly back inside, closing the door behind her with a sharp click. She locked it, bolting the bar and checking the windows. A sense of urgency filled her chest, something wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore it. She leaned against the door, trying to make sense of everything. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was she just being paranoid? Or was someone really stalking her? Her gaze shifted to the window where she had seen movement earlier. In the reflection, the trees looked ominous, looming like silent sentinels watching her every move. That's when she saw it. A figure. A shadow, barely discernible in the darkness, standing just beyond the tree line. It was too far away to make out any details, but she could feel the presence. They were there, watching. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as the shadow moved. It shifted between the trees, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. Panic set in. Her heart raced as her mind struggled to process what was happening. The figure could be anyone. A stranger, a hiker, or something far more sinister. But one thing was clear, she wasn't alone in the woods. She wasn't safe. Samantha rushed to the other window to check the other side of the cabin, but it was empty. Still, she knew better than to let her guard down. The person, or whatever it was out there, and they weren't just walking by. They were watching her. The hours dragged on as Samantha sat in the cabin, anxiously checking the windows and the door. She hadn't heard any more noises, and the figure she had seen outside hadn't reappeared, but the unease had settled deep into her bones. She kept the lights low, not wanting to draw attention, yet the feeling of being watched hadn't left her. It was as if the very walls of the cabin were closing in around her. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling of leaves outside, made her jump. Eventually, the clock struck midnight. Samantha tried to calm herself. She needed sleep. She couldn't let her fear rule her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the woods outside were waiting, patient, for her to slip up. The fire had long since burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and tried to find rest. Her eyes fluttered shut, but sleep never came. She kept drifting in and out of uneasy slumber, the image of that shadowy figure still fresh in her mind. And then, just as she had almost convinced herself that it was all in her head, the door slammed open. Samantha's eyes shot open, her pulse pounding in her throat. A figure loomed in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim moonlight. She couldn't make out their face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing dark clothing. The shape was clear enough to see, but their features were hidden in shadow. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. Her body acted on pure instinct. She bolted out of the chair, grabbing the nearest object she could, an old iron skillet, and threw it at the figure. The clatter was deafening, but the person didn't flinch. They stepped inside. "Get away!" Samantha screamed, backing into the corner of the room. She was panicked, but her thoughts were sharp. She couldn't let them get close. She needed to escape. The figure lunged toward her, but in a desperate move, Samantha grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and swung it with all her might. It struck the person's shoulder, knocking them back. For a moment, she thought she had gotten away, but as the figure regained their balance, they advanced again. Samantha's heart raced in her chest. She was trapped. Samantha's pulse thudded in her ears as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around for anything that could help her. The fire poker was still in her hand, but it felt more like a token than a weapon now. She had to think faster. The figure, though momentarily stunned, recovered quickly. With one swift movement, they grabbed her wrist, pinning her to the wall. The pressure on her arm was intense, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins dulled the pain. She twisted and kicked, trying to break free, but the grip was unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," the voice was low, cold. The words sent a jolt of fear through her chest, but she refused to let that fear consume her. With a burst of strength, Samantha slammed the fire poker into the person's side. They grunted in pain and released her, stumbling back. She didn't wait. She bolted for the door, barely managing to tear it open before the figure lunged at her again. She ran, her feet pounding against the dirt path that led deeper into the forest. The dense trees and uneven ground were obstacles, but they were also her best chance. The figure's footsteps echoed behind her, heavy and deliberate. They were closing in, but she couldn't let herself panic. The woods swallowed her. The dim moonlight barely pierced the canopy of leaves, leaving her in near total darkness. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of her, but she knew this forest better than anyone. It had been years since she'd camped here, but the familiar twists of the trail provided her with the briefest sense of comfort. She darted between trees, her breath ragged, and forced her mind to focus. Every sound, every crunch of leaves, every rustle in the bushes felt like the figure was mere inches away from grabbing her. Yet, when she glanced over her shoulder, there was nothing but the darkness, stretching endlessly in every direction. Samantha knew the rules of survival. Never stop moving. Never let the predator corner you. She had learned these rules as a child, growing up with her father in the wilderness, and though it had been years since she'd put them into practice, she was grateful for every lesson now. A glance behind her revealed movement, a flash of black, the figure weaving through the trees, relentless. Her legs burned, but she pushed harder. She had to keep going. Her mind raced through all the ways she could outwit them. She couldn't outrun them, she knew that. But she could outsmart them. Her eyes scanned the environment. The landscape here had changed over the years, the trees were taller now, the ground softer, but she remembered a stream that ran through the woods a mile or so ahead. The rushing water would mask her footsteps, give her a chance to slip away. She veered toward the stream, hoping the predator would miss the turn. She moved swiftly, trying to keep her movements quiet, but her breath came in ragged gasps. The predator was still there, just behind her, too close for comfort. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from behind, branches snapping violently. She didn't dare look back. The predator was getting too close. With every step, it felt like the space between them was shrinking. And then, in a flash, she reached the stream. She plunged her feet into the cold water, instantly feeling the cool rush against her legs. It was slippery, but it would help mask her scent and the sound of her steps. The rush of water drowned out the noise of her pursuer's movements, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe she might actually make it. But then, she heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, too close. Too deliberate. The predator wasn't fooled by the water. Samantha quickened her pace, stepping carefully across the rocks, trying to find her footing. She couldn't stop, not now. Not while the figure was still on her trail. Her foot slipped. She crashed down into the stream, the cold water rushing over her, but it wasn't enough to stop the momentum. She gritted her teeth, pushed herself up, and kept going, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The predator wasn't far behind. Suddenly, the world seemed to tilt. A hand grasped her ankle, pulling her back into the water with terrifying strength. She gasped as her head went under the surface for a brief, disorienting moment. Her heart hammered in her chest as she kicked her legs, twisting free of the grip. Desperation surged within her, and with one last effort, Samantha fought her way back to the shore, scrambling onto the muddy bank. She could feel the predator closing in. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide. The pursuit was closing in on her, and she needed to make a stand. By now, Samantha knew she couldn't keep running. The predator was too skilled, too relentless. She had to face them, or she would never survive. She paused at the base of a large oak tree, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her body screamed for rest, but her instincts told her to stay alert. She had one chance. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The sound of the stream was distant now, and the forest was eerily quiet. The silence was a heavy weight, pressing down on her chest. And then, from the shadows, the figure emerged. It was taller than she had anticipated, with broad shoulders and a menacing presence. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but their posture was unmistakable. This was no lost traveler or fellow hiker. This was the predator. Samantha's fingers tightened around the fire poker she had managed to grab on her way through the woods. She had no other weapon. This was it. "You can't run anymore," the voice was muffled by the hood, but the malice was clear. "This is your end." Samantha's grip tightened as she squared her shoulders. Her heart thundered in her chest, but she refused to let fear consume her. She wasn't going down without a fight. Without warning, she lunged forward, swinging the poker with all her might.